Hello, I'm Loyd Grossman, and I'm sitting in Dalt's magnificent bookshop in Marylebone, signing copies of my new book, An Elephant in Rome, and signed copies are available for sale. So, An Elephant for Rome, what's it about? Well, let's go to Rome. Let's go to Baroque Rome, 17th century Rome. The Rome which has given us great backdrops for films like The Gran Bellezza, bits of La Dolce Vita, the Rome that is intensely theatrical, the Rome that fascinates me in particular. Now, to me, London is the greatest city in the world, but in many ways, Rome is the most fascinating city in the world because nowhere else do you see so many layers of history rubbing against each other constantly. And of course, for 2,000 years, Rome was very central to what we could call Western civilization, certainly European civilization. The Baroque, what is it? Well, it's very easy to recognize and incredibly difficult to define. My favorite definition of it is that Baroque is when you throw a curve rather than using a straight line. And the Baroque is everywhere in Rome. It's a very emotional style. It's a very expressive style. It's kind of a crazy style, which may be why the British never really took to it. Also in this country, in Britain, it was regarded as being very associated with Catholicism, which of course was very suspect in the 17th and 18th century, and also with political absolutism, which we didn't like very much. So the Baroque that exists in this country is slightly kind of middle-of-the-road Baroque, Hawksmoor, brilliant, but compared to fully blown Roman or German Baroque, it's quite tame. Now, the great master of the Baroque is Gian Lorenzo Bernini. He's a name that is not exactly top of mind in the English-speaking world, but it's worth remembering that in the 17th century, which after all is the period of Rembrandt, Vermeer, Velázquez, Rubens, and some other very, very heavy hitters, Bernini was unquestionably the most famous, most highly sought after, the most loved artist in all of Europe. He was absolutely at the top of the artistic tree as a sculptor, as an architect, as a creator of pageants, and he was quite a good painter too. He had a very interesting life. He was the son of a jobbing sculptor who came from Florence and went down to Naples, where there was a lot of work going on, a lot of church building and palaces. And so Bernini grew up in an atmosphere of chisels and marble dust and was familiar with sculpting from a very early age. Unsurprisingly, he was a child prodigy, a kind of Mozart of sculpture. And when his father moved to Rome, the young Bernini was almost instantly recognized as an extraordinary talent. And by the time he was an early teenager, he was turning out magnificent portrait busts and came to the attention of the most important people in Rome, all of whom were involved in the papal court. The Pope was extraordinarily important. Let's remember that the Pope was not just a spiritual leader. He was also an incredibly important political leader. He had a secular kingdom, the Papal States, and he was the greatest of all patrons in Europe. So artists flocked to the papal court in Rome. It was the great honeypot. And in those days, before there was a commercial market for art, namely, you didn't just go into a shop and buy a picture, a piece of sculpture. The important thing was that artists should have patrons. And the artist-patron relationship was extraordinarily important. Bernini was not only a genius as an artist, but a genius at managing the relationship with his patrons. So he worked through a long succession of popes, and he was one of the very few artists who was able to work from one pope to the next. Unlike normal monarchies where there's an heir, the papacy was an elected monarch. So every time there was a new pope, and popes were usually quite elderly, so they didn't have very long reigns. Every time there was a new pope, there was a new family for him to enrich. There were new artists for him to hire. There were new people who had to be found jobs in the papal court. There was a constant churn, and only the most ambitious and the most diplomatically skillful people survived from one papal reign to another. Well, Bernini was employed by every pope throughout his whole life, including the three greatest popes in terms of influencing the look and the shape of Rome, who were Urban VIII, Innocent X, and finally Alexander VII. My book focuses on the relationship between Bernini and Alexander VII. Together, they were the greatest artistic double act in history. Alexander VII not only had a very, very large amount of money to spend, but he also had a vision. He actually had a model. He had a scale model of Rome in his private apartments. He was really a sort of proto-urban planner. He had a real idea of what Rome should be like. And this was mostly driven by political factors. So we've got to look at something that happened that was catastrophic for Europe and catastrophic for the Catholic Church, which was the 30 Years' War. From 1618 to 1648, Europe was torn apart in this confessional conflict, which was roughly between Protestant countries and Catholic countries, but often saw Protestants allied with Catholics and vice versa. So it was highly complicated. Every country in Europe was dragged into this. There was a major peace conference called the Peace of Westphalia, which was attempting to sort out this war. And the chief papal diplomat was someone called Fabio Chigi, who later became Alexander VII. His job was bringing peace to Europe and making sure that the position of the Catholic Church remained paramount. Unfortunately, he failed. The political influence of the Church went downhill very rapidly from the end of the 30 Years' War. Alexander VII then decided that he would turn to something which we now call soft diplomacy. Namely, he was going to use culture. He was going to use culture to make Rome the most desirable city in the world, the place where everyone of importance would wish to come, and that then would increase papal influence throughout all of Europe, Protestant and Catholic alike. Fortunately, he was a close friend of Bernini. Bernini could turn his hand to anything artistic, and together they shaped much of what we love and appreciate and find inspiring about Rome today. Bernini was a very, very complex character. On the one hand, he was highly religious, deeply pious. On the other hand, he was very hot-blooded. This was the sort of Neapolitan influence. One of the famous stories about Bernini is his early love affair with Costanza. He was passionately in love with her, so much so that he carved a marble bust of her. This was an amazing moment in art history because generally, a marble bust is a very expensive, very complex thing to create. So marble busts were dedicated to grandees, to gods and goddesses, to kings and queens of the higher nobility. For the first time in history, a life-size marble bust of an ordinary woman was carved, and this ordinary woman was the great love of Bernini's life. Unfortunately, she was married to his assistant and also having an affair with Bernini's brother. This created a huge scandal in mid-17th century Rome. Bernini hired a thug to slash her face because, of course, in those days it was always the woman's fault. Bernini's brother was exiled, and Bernini himself was ordered to get married. And he got married, had many children, and settled into some sort of domestic, if not bliss, at least routine. So he was a very hot-blooded, passionate person. He was also an extraordinary hard worker, a great manager of huge projects. One of the most striking of which is the baldacchino, the enormous bronze canopy over the high altar at St. Peter's, 30 meters high, cast bronze, an artistic achievement that shook the world in the 17th century because it was this extraordinary mix. No one could decide, was it architecture, was it sculpture, was it interior design? It was a whole new way of looking at art and the way in which art could influence people. Probably the greatest example of what Bernini could do is the piazza in front of St. Peter's Basilica. One of the most thrilling urban spaces in the world. And if the purpose of architecture is to increase the drama of living and make us all feel as if we're in some great drama, well, the Piazza of St. Peter's just wins hands down because it is impossible to stand there without feeling exhilarated, enthralled, and inspired. It's a huge subject, Bernini and Baroque Rome. So I took as my point of departure a very arresting life-size statue of an elephant in the Piazza della Minerva, an elephant which has an Egyptian obelisk on its back, and an elephant which is dedicated to the memory of Pope Alexander VII. So you might ask yourself, why would anyone carve an elephant to memorialize a pope? Well, you'll have to read the book.